Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I am very excited to welcome my guest today, Cadwell Turnbull, who is the author of a book that I raved about quite a bit on my blog. And so those of you who follow will probably already know that I was a big fan of his most recent novel, Gods, No Monsters, which is what we're mostly going to be talking about today, because I admit I haven't gotten around to reading your debut novel yet, The Lesson. I will be reading it soon.
No worries.
It sounds
Really
great. But you're a science fiction, and I consider this novel to be science fiction and horror, kind of like in that Clive Barker dark fantasy kind of thing. But you've been nominated for a few awards, and The Lesson was a big hit. So thank you for joining me today on Postcards from a Dying World. Very excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, where did you grow up, and how did you get into genre fiction? I know I ask everybody this, but we kind of want to. I always am interested in how people's geography and where they grew up kind of like turn them into the people that they are.
Well, I grew up in the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas to be specific. There's some scenes in the novel, No Gods, that are set back home. And then, The Lesson is set primarily on St. Thomas as well. I don't know how it happened. I guess my mom was kind of a science nerd. She watches a lot of science fiction, like films and TV shows, and I would watch them with her. She had a collection of VHS tapes and a lot of Star Trek movies, and so I watched that with her. And she's just a fan of the genre, and so watching that with her, watching TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Charmed and Stargate SG-1, I got interested in genre by watching too much TV, honestly. And then when I got to college, a friend of mine put me on to Ursula Le Guin, read a few books from her, read my favorite book of all time, The Dispossessed, as a recommendation from this friend, and kind of started playing around in the genre and didn't look back from there. So watched a lot of TV, then read some science fiction when I got a little bit older.
Now we'll come back to Le Guin and The Dispossessed because it's all over this book. In Easter eggs and more direct things. I'm obviously a huge fan of Le Guin and The Dispossessed. And I think it has a lot to do with the world that this book kind of takes place in. So we'll come back to that. But, well, that's awesome. Like, a lot of times some people don't want to admit how much of it was sitting down and watching TV, but of course it was for me too. I'm more of a Stargate Atlantis fan than SG.
I love Stargate Atlantis too.
Yeah, and I thought Universe was underrated, and I thought it was really cool they were doing something different.
I loved it. Yeah, I loved it. Yeah. I wish it went on for longer, for sure.
Yeah, totally. So I there's no snobbery here. I just want to be clear, because I definitely enjoy, watching Star Trek when I was a little kid was how I got interested in space and all this as well. And I still consider myself a Trekker to this day. But, and anybody who listens to this podcast knows this because I do lots of Star Trek talk on here. But that's really cool. But you think Le Guin was kind of one of those foundational writers for you. Are there any other writers that, when you got into it in college, that you consider foundational besides Le Guin?
No, it's really Le Guin. When I was in high school, we read, the classics, the classics that you don't know are spec until much later. So we read A Brave New World, and 1984. 1984 is one of my favorite books as well. It's just super, super depressing. But at the time, I didn't know it was spec. It was in my mind, treated as a literary classics book. But it's definitely a spec book. And so I also named that as an influence. I mean, generally because it was focused on politics and social systems. And I think that's one of the reasons I really like Le Guin as well. As I got older, I got into Butler, and Butler is also a huge influence, but I have to admit that was later on. It wasn't, that wasn't where I arrived at first. But Butler is a huge influence. Now I would say authors like N.K. Jemisin and Ted Chiang are also influences of mine. Really, growing fan, big fan of Emily St. John Mandel. So all over the place now, but it started, I think, pretty much with Orwell Le Guin.
Right. Well, that's cool. And so where did you go to college again? I'm sorry, I may have missed that part, but.
Well, no, I didn't say it. I went to La Roche University. At the time, it was a college. It was a small. It's still a small university, but now it got upgraded, and that was in Pittsburgh, in the North Hills of Pittsburgh.
Oh,
it was
cool.
Yeah.
My father went to grad school at Pitt, so we spent a lot of time. We'd visit Pittsburgh a lot. My dad was a lifelong Pittsburgh sports guy, so I got forced to watch lots of sports as a child. But,
oh, that's awesome. Well, not the forced part. I love that city.
Yeah. Well, Pittsburgh is an underrated city as far as there was a lot of cool stuff going on there. Cool bands, restaurants, things started by people who grew up there and wanted to make Pittsburgh a better place. I'm familiar with a little bit of that, but is that where you got interested in anarchist organizing? Because that is also a theme that kind of is throughout this book. It seems to me.
Oh, that's a good question. So the friend that recommended Le Guin to me, and the first book that she recommended was The Loth of Heaven, which is a really great book. It also shows up in No Gods, No Monsters. And she was an anarchist. And when I was there, I did some, I think it was like extra credit work at the Thomas Merton Center, which was like a, political activist organization. They had a newspaper called The New People. They were very, very left. And so did some work there, got into some organizing from that. But I think a lot of it has just grown out of, being friends with anarchists or reading about it or reading fiction that was influenced by it. My own feelings are, I'm very much ideologically aligned. I wouldn't say that I consider myself, and Le Guin talked about this too. I don't think she said, she was an activist, but she was influenced by the ideology. And I would say that's the same with me. It just makes more sense to me than anything else. So it shows up a lot in work that I do.
Well, what's kind of funny about how committed to Le Guin anarchists are, because a lot of people discovered The Dispossessed and Le Guin through anarchists recommending the book to them. A lot of people, which is, and I have a couple thoughts on that, but one of the funny things is that from an old school science fiction nerd perspective, Norman Spinrad was much more vocal about being an anarchist, and he wrote anarchist novels like The Void Captain's Tale, for example, but never got the attention for being an anarchist that Le Guin got. And that's partially because Le Guin wrote a better book. As much as I love Spinrad, and I'm a big fan of his, The Dispossessed is just an amazing novel.
It is.
The one thing that I will point anarchists to is that The Dispossessed is like Anarchism 101, and if people make it to Always Coming Home, her novel Always Coming Home is like a masterclass in anarchism. and in my opinion, but
that book has been on my list forever. Like I was just talking to someone on Twitter recently. I really want to read everything she's written. The only reason I haven't read that book yet is because it's huge. It's kind of intimidating. Yeah.
I will say it is not a great novel and it's not a fun novel, but just for anarchist ideas,
Mhm.
it is a masterclass. And that's one of the reasons why people don't read it quite as often, because it doesn't tell as good of a story as The Dispossessed. But as far as just
Right.
anarchist thinking, it's really great.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And that's the one, Always Coming Home is the one where you can tell that she had famous anthropologist parents. For sure.
Reading the description for it, you can tell she's being influenced by the real work, of doing that kind of stuff, and then marrying that with science fiction is really kind of cool.
Well, I need to rewind a little bit, I think, here. Coming from the Virgin Islands, did you come here for college, or did you move here like earlier than that?
Yeah, I came for college.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
Karen Lord, obviously being like a very famous writer, from coming from a Caribbean background, it's not, you're not the first one to do it, but it is a unique perspective in that you bring something to not just this novel, but to the genre, and like that perspective. I'm sure coming to the States, also to a whole new perspective around the time you were learning to read genre fiction, probably had a huge influence on like how you viewed politics in our country, right? I don't know if that makes sense as a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, and I'm definitely influenced as well by other Caribbean writers. Karen Lord is one of them. Nala Hopkinson is also another writer that I greatly admire. I would say it's one of those things, right? You read something and there's a character in the book that's like this. He starts reading about anarchism and then he realizes that that's what he is. Like it wasn't a thing that I feel like I always felt that way. It was reading that confirmed things for me, that was feelings, internal feelings that I had, that I didn't know how to name. I just could feel that something was wrong, with just how we organize society. And so when I started reading writers like Le Guin, it became apparent that this was the feeling that I was having that I couldn't name. And so yeah, I do think that moving away, and I did that deliberately. I did want to get out of, St. Thomas is a very small place. I wanted to go somewhere else and experience snow, for example. And so, yeah, it did. It was quite an experience. You know what? I've told people this before. It's kind of strange, but I remember the first time I looked outside and it was a sunny day, like the sun was out, there was no clouds in the sky, and it was cold. It was the first time I experienced a sunny day that was cold. And it was extremely jarring for me. But yeah, I wanted to get out of, my comfort zone, and so I did, and ended up finding, a love of genre and a love of, writers like Le Guin that, kind of pushed my thinking on certain things and confirmed some other things for me.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the Le Guin Easter eggs, and that I'm a person that as soon as I saw the name of the bookstore in the novel, I knew exactly what you were talking about because I am a Dispossessed fan. And I did say that I kind of wish that had stayed, just for the people who knew. But I understand that now from talking to you that you were expressing a part of your story in kind of the autobiographical parts of the book, that Le Guin was kind of was important, and then I had to remind myself that it's not about me, and that it's good for other people to learn about the Gwyn. Because I'm sure you will teach people that there will be people who will find the Gwyn from your book, you know, and that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I know for other people, Le Guin is pretty basic, but not for me. It was definitely a thing where I grew up in a place that was not there was not a bunch of science fiction books lying around, and there was not a lot of science fiction books that were talking about really interesting and amazing politics lying around. When Le Guin came to me, it blew my mind. I did not know that was that. It felt like a whole world had opened up. And so, you know, that does make it into the book. I evangelize a lot. It seems super basic to some people, but to me, it was extremely formative.
Yeah. Well, and I just finished reading a nonfiction book about his life, but for me, I'm the same way with John Brunner, who's a British science fiction writer, and his novel Staying on Zanzibar, in my opinion, is the greatest science fiction novel of the 20th century. And I'm almost evangelical about Brunner. Even though I do a Philip K. Dick podcast, my other podcast, if I'm pressed, I will say that John Brunner is the best science fiction writer of the 20th century, in my opinion. Although,
wow,
yeah, well, and Le Guin's up there. Obviously, she's in the top 5 for me. But and what's really cool too is in the next month I'm going up to the Bay Area to go with a scholar friend of mine to visit all like the Phil K. Dick sites, the places he lived, his childhood home, and we're going to Le Guin's childhood home as well, because a lot of people.
That's so dope.
Yeah, well, what's really cool is that Phil K. Dick and Ursula Le Guin went to high school together at Berkeley High.
That's impossible. That's insane.
Yeah, 1 year apart, and they didn't know each other. They did not
insane.
Yeah, it's very crazy. So I'll send you pictures from the home.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Jealous.
Yeah. I'm really excited about the trip, but I do think that the teaching the history of Le Guin, specifically for what you were saying, is somebody who can be revolutionary, who can open your eyes to these things. It's a really good way to give back in fiction, to include them, because there will be, especially younger people, who will be finding these books who don't know who Ursula Le Guin is. So I appreciate that part of this book. So let's talk about how you got into writing, and then we'll come back around to No Gods, No Monsters. We're geeking out a little. We're doing side quests here.
Right.
How did you take seriously writing? Was that in college or after college? Because I'm sure it has to do with, if you weren't reading the genre seriously, you probably hadn't started writing it then.
Well, no, I started writing before college. So I wrote in high school. I have a kind of corny story for how I started, thinking about being a writer. But when I did start, I was reading a lot of urban fiction, because that was what my sister had around the house. I was picking up her books and reading them and digging them, and then started writing like urban fiction books. Basically just, I want to say book stories that I tried to expand into novels, but never got to novel, about people in their 20s having complications with dating. Driving around a lot, not having real jobs. Like, no one had jobs in my stories. They just kind of drive to each other's houses and have like, emotional conversations. And but I was, in high school reading things that I didn't know was spec at the time, but was spec. And I started writing in college a fantasy book that never went anywhere. And that's when I started reading spec. But I was writing from before. I was writing fiction too, but it was not the fiction that I ended up writing.
Got it. And so was it in college that you started taking seriously writing speculative fiction? Or that's when that happened, right?
Yes, stages of serious. So serious in undergrad, to the extent that I was actually trying to write spec. Really serious in graduate school is when I tried to like nail down the craft of writing a good spec story. Like the stuff I was writing in undergrad was not, it was not good. But in grad school, I was making a good effort to write, good stories that also had, speculative ideas and, figuring out ways to not have all my characters just spouting, philosophical musings all the time, which was pretty much my undergrad stories. Lots of people sharing their ideologies. Yeah.
And your first novel, The Lesson, was that your first serious attempt at a novel, or do you have a couple drunk novels that? I mean, a lot of writers have the novels they don't want ever to get out at their first attempt.
Right. I'm actually currently revising a trunk novel. I'm working on this new concept, and I'm working with some other authors. And one project that we're doing is kind of reviving, dead books, but turning them into something different through this meta narrative that we've co-created together. And so I'm working on that. It is a terrible book, but I'm hoping by the end of it that there'll be at least, I don't know, it will be not so terrible. It might not end up being a novel. It might end up being a novella I have to cut so much, but I'm hopeful that it'll be relatively decent by the time we're done with it. But yeah,
you learned a lot writing it.
I hope so. I hope something went into that. The lesson was my first attempt at a serious book, and it wasn't always a book. It kind of became a book as I was working on it. I didn't know what it was at first.
Yeah, I know that sometimes non-writers don't understand. Like, I have a novel that I realized 2/3 of the way through that it wasn't working, that it would not work, but I finished it anyways, just for my peace of mind. Like, I went ahead and finished it, even though I was like, I knew I was not gonna do anything with it. I just said, I'm gonna finish this, and then partially because I thought that maybe someday, maybe I'll figure out a way to fix it and I'll have the skeleton of it. But so was The Lesson your second attempt, or was it down the line a little bit?
I think technically my third. I tried writing a novel in high school, but it was again urban fiction. And then I tried writing a fantasy novel in undergrad and got pretty far. I got like 60,000 words in. And then started working on The Lesson and didn't know. I kind of given up on novels for a while because of that failed attempt. So I was working on stories for a while, and then over time was working in this particular world, this story world a lot, and developing it. And my advisors at the time told me that I had a novel, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that's what I was doing. And then started thinking about it and thinking about, if this was a novel, what would it be doing and where would it be going? And there was a lot of seeds that were being set up in the work that I was working on. So, kind of just followed my gut there and got The Lesson.
Wow, that's cool. And sold it and found a home for it and got it out there. So
yeah, cool. All surprises.
Yeah. And how do you feel about that novel now? Like, obviously I haven't read it yet. It's on my list. The way I do things is, once I decide I'm going to read a novel, I try to forget what it's about so I can go into it cold, so I don't read The Dust Jacket or anything again. Like, for whatever reason, I knew months ago I decided I wanted to read this, and then now I'll go into it cold. So I don't remember very much about I know that it's science fiction, and but other than that, I've been trying to keep myself cold. But you can spoil it for me again, because but what was the genesis of this book?
Well, it's a first contact novel, so it's aliens aliens in the Virgin Islands, basically, and it was inspired by a dream. Like I had this, I don't know, dream / nightmare, I don't know, it was one of those dreams. My wife has a ton of vivid dreams that she remembers when she wakes up, but I tend to forget most of my dreams. This one was really vivid and I remembered most of it. And it was a, small town somewhere. Aliens were living among people and they looked just like people, but they had like this big cultural difference where they were very, I don't know, they perceived most things as threats. They just had a heightened sense of what was threatening. And if you did something that they thought was threatening, they would respond with extreme violence. And it was kind of like this kind of impulsive reaction that was deeply culturally ingrained. And it was about this one woman alien that was trying to change, but having some challenges changing. She still had that same knee-jerk response, but was trying to work through it and had a lot of guilt around it. And it was just such a vivid dream that it just stuck with me for years. And eventually I was like, I want to write this story, but I want to set it in the Virgin Islands because it was set in some like suburban town somewhere. And so I changed the setting, and then all of these other things came up. And that very first story was just like those original characters transplanted to the Virgin Islands and, very quiet. And then I just started getting more and more curious about that world and started building out from there. But general premises, first contact, aliens show up that have this kind of response to, heightened stress, threat response, and how that causes, tensions within the community and that sort of thing.
Sounds great. I did read a lot about it right after I read No Gods, No Monsters. It sounded great. Now, so for No Gods, No Monsters, your follow-up, you kind of went a different direction. Was there any hesitancy to going more dark fantasy or going to horror? Or
No,
reason for it. It's great.
no, I didn't. Before I attended Clarion West, which is a science fiction fantasy workshop you attend for 6 weeks. It's the one in Seattle.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so before that I hadn't written horror, but I would say that bits of the lesson as I was working on it were horror influence, and I just didn't realize it. I write lots of tension and lots of creepiness, but not intentionally. And so I dabbled a bit in horror for the first time when I was at that workshop and found that I really liked it. But I had been writing short stories that were fantasy, science fiction, slipstream, magical realist, all over the place for a while. So it just seemed natural to me to write. I just write in all of the genres, all of the spec genres. So when I was working on this one, I was like, oh, I want to try that genre. I hadn't written anything in that genre, so I was like, let me try it and see what happens.
Now, one author you have not mentioned, but I'm going to make this comparison because I know a lot of my listeners are fans of Clive Barker, but the comparison with not only the dark fantasy kind of horror vibe, this novel has a real like 90s Clive Barker, like Great Secret Show, Everville feel, which to me is a great compliment. But the one that obviously is going to draw some comparisons because of the similar kinds of themes is Cabal and Nightbreed, being that that book is about discrimination and monsters being, the real monsters being the humans and that kind of thing. And I wasn't sure if Clive Barker was an influence, but it was definitely like, I think readers want to have comps all the time. They want to hear like, oh, this is like this and this. I really think this book will appeal to fans of Nightbreed and Cabal, and whether, I don't know if you read Clive Barker, I don't know, but that's a book that I think people have always wanted to have more monster books like it, because it's and well, they're very different books, I'm not saying this is super close, but in themes it's very similar. Is Clive Barker an influence at all, or have you read much Clive Barker, or am I pulling that out of the ether?
Not at all. I have heard of Clive Barker from horror friends that read Clive Barker and have been influenced by Clive Barker, and so he's come up a lot in conversations. I've been meaning to read it, and yeah, and now I'm very, very interested in those two novels in particular. I'm gonna actually like ping you so you can give me those. It's Cabal, right? Cabal is the one that is the closest.
That he adapted it into a movie, Nightbreed.
Oh, dope.
Yeah, and there was a lot of studio fuckery, so I would recommend reading the book first.
Okay.
But No Gods, No Monsters and Cabal are very similarly themed in the sense of, and one of the things you have to remember about Clive Barker is, he became famous in the 80s as a horror writer, and he was like the first out and openly super out gay horror writer who didn't give a shit, right, what anybody thought of him. And Cabal is definitely kind of inspired by that, like, I don't feel comfortable in society kind of thing. But also he was tired of, as a guy who grew up loving monsters, of monsters always being the villains, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you'll see. That's why one of the reasons why immediately when I read this book I was like, oh man, this is for fans of Cabal and Nightbreed for sure. So definitely
that's super cool.
And I think with your taste, you will really the tone comparison with Clive Barker is his novel The Great and Secret Show, which is you'll see like what I'm talking about as far as tone if you do read it. And there is a sequel called Everville, and I think the one thing that I kind of feel bad recommending these books to you is that he's never finished the third book.
The curse.
Yeah. And I was at an awards dinner, and they sat all the vegetarians together, so we sat at the table with him, and I got to hear him talk about the third book, but he never wrote it. So, and it was like one of those times where I was like, I wish I had written this down, but he just never was able to bring it for. But I highly recommend for also for fans of this book who might be coming to this podcast as your fans, that they would enjoy it as well. So, anyways, enough about Clive Barker. Back to No Gods, No Monsters. So there will be a point where I'll give a spoiler warning and we'll get really nitty gritty on it. But where did this idea originate? Obviously, I feel like some of the anarchist organizers that you were friends with, sounds like in Pittsburgh, were probably a huge part of this, of where this started or where this idea came from. But yeah, where did No Gods, No Monsters originate?
That's a big question. It's a ton of different influences. So one of them, is shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I also, really like, dark fantasy stuff, and supernatural stuff, and wanted to write in the genre, but didn't start reading urban fantasy until fairly recently. And so got into reading urban fantasy, was a big fan of urban fantasy in TV and film. One of my, favorite films, growing up was Underworld. I just love that movie. and I even love the bad sequels. So you know what I mean? Like I'm a huge fan of this kind of like secret world of monsters meeting other monsters and duking it out, at war with each other for various reasons, and the human world kind of only is half aware that that's going on, and that kind of stuff. So just being a fan of that.
You're gonna lose your mind for Cabal, believe me.
Okay. Okay. So being a huge fan of that kind of stuff, and then getting interested. So starting out pretty much when I was in Pittsburgh, being interested in anarchism and lefty political ideologies generally. Got during grad school, got interested in cooperatives and just kind of like applied radical politics. So like taking consensus decision making and putting that with businesses and housing and all of this stuff, and got a little involved in like cooperative activism. Joined a collective that was about like publishing articles and essays about cooperatives, and a lot of cooperative organizers that were a part of the collective as well. And so, pulling a lot of that just interest into it. So it was like monsters, but the monsters aren't bad guys. Co-op stuff and the influences for that, my own reading, being a spec person and, loving Le Guin and all that stuff. So I was like, bring that in. And then, the other part of it, this kind of like, shadow society stuff that I find really interesting in media and TV, film, books, and bringing that in as well, and pairing it with cosmology that I've been like, metaphysical stuff that I've been interested in for a really long time, and building out in my head that I couldn't, it just didn't work every time I tried to put it in a story. And for some reason, it just worked with No Gods, No Monsters. There was just enough weirdness happening already that some of the other weirdness kind of jived with it. So
what's awesome for me with this book is that you're talking about a lot of different influences, a lot of different things, and they meld together really well in this book. It all comes together in a really great way. And I think it's a good lesson for younger writers who, like, you can do all these elements if you're paying attention to the story and how it threads together. So we'll get more into that because I like to nerd out about narrative construction.
Okay.
So we'll get into that. But the inciting incident of the book was the murder of an innocent person by, I believe it was Boston cops, right? And what I thought was really interesting about what this, and I'm currently writing an article about what the horror novels of 2020 say about the year we all experienced, right? The ones that accidentally came out at that time. But it seems to me, you talk about this fracture effect in the book. There's a concept that this inciting incident, and keep in mind, we were all traumatized in 2020 by like living through, the whole world watched George Floyd get murdered, right? And it became this thing that changed everything. You were probably writing this book long before that happened, but this concept of the whole world changing because of this inciting incident seemed to be speaking to that moment in history, to me anyways. And that's something that I really enjoyed about the inciting incident in the book. So the fracture effect, can you explain what that is in the book?
Right. The basic idea is that a thing happens and it's so out of the ordinary and strange that people split, depending on where you are, politically or ideologically, or just your experiences as a person, you split, along different lines. You either believe the thing is real or you don't believe it. And, each group has their reasons and justifications for taking their side, but it's very much that the society is split in half about it. It's a moment in time where there is not a consensus on reality. Like, reality is new and different in some way, but we have not agreed on what it is.
Which sounds like American experience to me.
Right, right. I feel like there's a lot of, comparisons you can draw. And at the time I was like, are people gonna buy this? This kind of, at first I was thinking, oh, everyone believed it right away. And I was like, no, no, that's not gonna happen. It's too big of a thing for everyone to believe, this idea that monsters are real. And so, I started playing around with this idea that, well, there's a split, and the split has like a lot of underlying psychological effects, but it's hard to pin down. And I thought people wouldn't believe it, and it would be, a strange idea. But, the pandemic happened, and we know how, we don't align on reality when it comes to, these kinds of things. And this is a really good example of it. But there's been other things in the past.
I think the Kyle Rittenhouse trial is a prime example of how it's like a Rorschach test for how people view what happened. And so that was something that I thought was really brilliant in this note. So
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that that was a really smart narrative decision, and it branched out really interesting things where some people like believe that the monsters are here, and some are like trying very hard to like see no evil, right? Right. And I thought that was really cool. And in that way, your monsters are a little bit subtler than they're not like kaijus walking around, right? But and it's funny because I kind of jokingly said that this was an anarchist werewolf novel, because I thought that would, and the reason I did that was because I thought, well, that'll get people's attention if I say it's an anarchist werewolf novel, and then people will come to my review and then see that, and it's not inaccurate. But you said when I posted my review that a lot of people were not talking about the anarchist politics of it. And that surprised me because that's such a huge part of this book to me. Like, are you having the experience that people are not noticing that as much as the other parts of the story?
Well, I mean, some people notice it a lot, and they talk about it, but most people don't notice it much. But there's enough things going on in the book that I feel like, I've paid attention to some reviews, and, reviews kind of decide, they pick what they're going to focus on, and they talk a lot about that thing. And so it's, anarchism tends to be the thing that is put to the side often in reviews.
Now, narrative-wise, there's lots of characters here, and you there's a couple times that the POV shifted where I had to kind of slow down and reread things just to be like, okay, who am I with? Which is fine. I actually think that's great, because I'm a I don't like filler, so I don't like a lot of info dumps. So I'd rather go back and be like, okay, where am I? But you also have the perspective of where some of your characters go back to the islands, some of them, stay in the situation. So you have a lot of different perspectives and point of views. How do you determine the rhythm of where you're going with which characters and what point of views? Like, and why did you just? I mean, first of all, I'm not a fan of first person, so I prefer when we can go through different characters and multiple point of views. But what was the importance of the multiple point of views in this book?
The lesson is also a multi-POV book. I just do it. That's what, the simple, most honest answer is my brain goes in that direction. But, honestly, when I started working on the lesson and it became this kind of like multi-POV looking at a moment in history where there's a significant, event that causes social change. This tends to be the thing that I also like. No Gods, No Monsters and the lessons share that in common. There's a thing that happens, and then a bunch of people respond to it in their personal lives, and then it has effects in the world. and exploring the effects of that event through a lot of different people's POVs and filtering that through people's experiences. That to me is really interesting. But the big thing what I like about that is it allows me to tell a story where there's not a single person that is responsible for X happening. That there's not a protagonist, it's not a hero that saves the world. In my mind, the way that the world actually changes is messier, where there's a lot of interacting groups with their own agendas that hit up against each other in a moment of great change. And then through that change the world becomes something new, And so No Gods, No Monsters, and it's a trilogy. So hopefully I finish this trilogy. When you brought up Clive Barker, I was like, oh no, don't say that. It's very much for me trying to trace a moment of great change where a bunch of different, opposing factions are hitting up against each other as these things are happening, and by the end of it, the world will be very different, but it won't be because one person was a hero. It would be because, culture and personal motivations and ideology and loss and trauma, all these things are kind of creating a stew where change is also happening. And that's why I think it's really important to just have books. If I'm trying to justify my own habit here, it feels like a good idea to have books that treat perspective as a feature of the book. Like, it's important to show different perspectives and how that difference creates momentum in a story.
Well, what I think is really cool is this is an origin story in many ways, but it has so many profound moments that it doesn't entirely feel like, it feels like a closed book that if I'm obviously interested and I want to read more, and I can see where you're setting up the world for deeper things, but it's cool to have an origin story that's as profound as it is. And the last thing that I want to say before I get into spoilers, before we get nitty gritty on things, is that another thing that I really appreciated about the book, and one thing that I want to sell to people who maybe haven't read it yet, is that you write great cosmic horror in tiny moments of, and I know you mentioned cosmology as a thing, and there is that influence here. It's mostly in subtle moments. It's not like Lovecraft, where it's the entire plot of a story, right? But there are these moments where you get this grand cosmic scale. And what I thought was really neat about that is that's where you really feel that you're in an origin story. And I thought that did a really good job of making me as a reader feel like there's a wider universe and there's bigger and grander things to come. Am I correct about that? Because you got 2 more books to go, but I felt like those moments of cosmic horror were kind of prelude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah. So the way that I imagine the trilogy, in terms of focus, going is, the first book is about people, where there's some intersection with the monsters, and then the second book is the monster book, and then the third book is the gods. There's no, if you're paying attention to this book, there's gods all over the place, and they have their own narrative, they have their own conflicts, and that stuff is kind of hitting up against the human world, and the humans are catching like the tail ends of things. They're like, there's this massive iceberg of cosmic stuff happening, and occasionally, in one scene they're at like a collective meeting. They hit up against it, and they don't know what they're looking at. Even some of the monsters don't know what they're looking at, but it's there.
We'll drill down on that in spoilers.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, so anything last you want to say before we get into spoilers for anyone who maybe has not read the book yet? Because people could definitely pause before we get to spoilers, go buy the book, read it, come back, finish the episode. But last sales pitch for anyone who has not read No Gods, No Monsters yet.
I'm a terrible salesperson.
Then hopefully I'm hoping I've sold it pretty well. And I'm telling you, saying anarchist werewolf gets people's attention because, you know, even though I know there's more monsters than the shapeshifters, I think that gets people's attention. So
that's great. There's definitely that going on.
Yeah. All right. So here's your spoiler warning. So you can pause the episode if you haven't read it. If you have read it, stick around. So we're going to get more into things. So now let's talk about that. The safe space is a really important thing in anarchist communities and providing safe space. And I think the safe space for monsters theme kind of comes up in chapter 36 when there's this collective meeting. And for somebody who's been a part of anarchist collective meetings where I had to wait on the stack and I had to raise my hand, and where we were trying to make business decisions based on consensus, which is super hard to do, but rewarding. Right? This idea that there was this scene where they're advocating for monsters and against discrimination in this anarchist collective meeting was obviously hit home for me, and I loved this chapter. So maybe we can. Now you don't have to worry. At this point, we're assuming everyone's read it.
Okay. I'm glad. I'm glad that resonated, because that chapter is strange for a lot of people. But being a part of collectives, doing collective stuff, it's one of those things that I was just like, this has to show up somehow. And, marrying that kind of like, I don't want to say long-winded, but like, it takes a lot of work to talk through things in this form, and so the kind of dry affair of talking through a thing and all of the ramifications of a thing where everyone gets to speak on it and feel heard and come to some kind of agreement on what's the most comfortable approach for everyone, was something I really wanted to do, while having this kind of like rumbling thing going on in the background, and then like having all of these things crash in on each other at once. To me, that's like the biggest moment in the book, even though it doesn't happen. It's not the climax at all, but in my mind, that's where all of the forces combine. All of the elements of the book are in one place in that scene, and it becomes this big like meeting point. And yeah, it was fun.
As somebody who, I was a part of a campaign where in my small college town that I grew up in, we stopped a golf course from being built in one of the last green spaces, and we organized the entire campaign through anarchist principles of consensus. And so I've been in a lot of really intense meetings where you're doing it that way. And I think for those of us who have seen or made major change that way, it is super meaningful to see, because you and I both know that there's a certain power to how democracy works that way, when you're giving everyone a voice and you're not giving up until everyone feels comfortable, right?
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons why that novel, or this novel and that chapter, I get it. That's because it's such an important moment for how these people interact with this new reality. It's very powerful stuff. I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, and so there's also a scene. Okay, so you have a lot of monsters, not just, I know I keep picking on the werewolves, but there's skin shedders and there's all kinds of things. How did you kind of, you must have had a lot of fun devising that culture. That monster kind of culture and who was there, was that by the seat of your pants, or did you plan that out ahead of time?
A bit of both. So, I knew that, I've been reading a lot of shifter books. So I knew that I wanted to write, shifters, and there's werewolf shifters, but there's also other shifters. And this book that I'm working on now explores some other, kinds of shifters. But I knew I wanted to do the shifters. I knew I wanted vampires, but to not activate them yet. So they're kind of just hanging out in the background. But I also knew I wanted to do like Caribbean folklore. And so like, pulling in some stories that I've heard as a kid and making those a feature of the book, making those a part of the book as well was something I was excited about. And then, there was some other things that came about through the mechanics of how the magic works, which isn't a part of this book. It's only like vaguely hinted at, but some of the monsters that existed, and they call themselves monsters out of solidarity, but like there's like witches and mages, and those aren't monsters, the way that we think about them, but they are from the magical realm, and they call themselves monsters out of solidarity. And that stuff kind of came organically out of me thinking about the magic system. And then there's some other things that just kind of was like, wouldn't that be cool? And then I just put it in.
Now, one of the most powerful parts of the book is there's a scene where a character is given, or is kind of considering whether to become a monster or not. And one of the characters says, do you still want to be changed? Because if you really want this, you can't hate me if it turns out the way, if it doesn't turn out the way you want it. But we see a lot of times, I thought of this as being kind of, a part of the narrative that it's really cool that young people today feel much more comfortable with fluid ideas of gender and sexuality in ways that when at least when I was growing up, there wasn't as much of that. And so I thought this was a really powerful scene where you were talking very seriously about the idea of, yeah, you may think it's cool to be this other thing, but like make sure you understand, what choice you're really making. I thought that was a really powerful scene. So any thoughts on that part?
Yeah, I've been watching actually quite recently, yesterday, the Netflix, the third season of Sex Education on Netflix. I really like this show. It's high schoolers getting in touch with their sexuality. But one of the things that's like a big part of the show is just like fluidity, of sexuality and representation, and with a lot of empathy. And that's what I love about the show. And there's a scene where two people are kind of deciding whether or not they're going to start a relationship. And one of them, for the first two seasons is like a, very, let's say very hetero, like cishet guy, superstar of the school. But he has this interest and attraction with this non-binary person. And, they basically tell him like, you do realize that if we go further, this is going to be a queer relationship. And then that's the first time it dawns on him, and you could see him like, what, like, and he kind of, gets, he needs some time to process. And, I've seen people talk about the monsters in this book as like, an analogy for other forms of identity otherness. In my mind, it's an intersectional identity marker. So it's just another thing that you can be in relation to all the other things you are. And so being a queer monster is different than being, a Black monster. Being a rich monster is different than being a poor monster. These things represent differently, in the world. And it's one of those moments where one person that has a very limited understanding of what it means to be a monster, they're trying to figure out what a monster is themselves. Rebecca isn't from the monster world. She's kind of been caught up in it. And she's talking to this other person that's interested in it. And she's saying like, this thing has repercussions, it carries. And if you have to think about the way it carries as well. It's not just the thing, it's cool if you want to be a monster to connect with your brother, but there's other things that are going to happen as a result of you being a monster that you have to think about. There's ways that it complicates your life. and that whole section is about how it complicates Rebecca's life. And so like it's yeah, it to me it's very intersectional, and it's one of those moments where I'm trying to like point to that intersectionality.
Yeah, it's really cool. Um, okay, so now here's a big one for this book, and I couldn't do this outside of spoilers because it's like huge and spoilery. Like with the title, I want to talk about the scene where they have the protest with the "No Gods, No Monsters" chant. And for those who don't know, you do a good job of explaining what I didn't need explained to me, which is that there's a phrase in the anarchist community, and it goes back very far in the anarchist community, which is "No gods, no masters." But in this world, like you said earlier, there's gods throughout this book, and what it makes really interesting is that you have the anarchist characters that are embracing the monsters as a part of this society. However, along with this fracture effect of showing the monsters are here, it also shows that the gods are here, and that so the monsters are something that the anarchists want to embrace. But the challenge is what else comes with that. If I'm reading this correctly, but this was a really powerful scene in the book, and I'm wondering, narratively, like, you know, how did you get to this point in the story? Because I love this scene, but am I reading this dilemma correctly? Because that's kind of where I saw it.
Okay, well, okay. Which scene? Let me make sure I know which.
Where they, the man yells, "No gods, no monsters." The crowd chants back.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because you know the title of this book is it's saying that there's none of these things that there actually are a lot of. You know, like the book is like "No gods, no monsters," and there's a ton of these things. It's more of like a ideological stance. It's like this idea of like aboveness and belowness, and you know, and the reason why I felt like I needed to explain it in this case is because it's through this you know, taking this, you know, old slogan, this very, you know, this slogan with a deep history, and changing it to mean "No gods, no monsters," it creates a new way of thinking about the slogan. The slogan is different now that it's been changed in this way. And so it's this idea of, yes, there are monsters and yes, there are gods, though the people that are using that slogan don't know they're gods.
But we don't see them as gods, and we don't see these people as monsters, right?
Right. There's no one above anyone else, and there's no one below anyone else. We're all the same on the same level, and we need to treat each other accordingly, despite all of the things that monsters bring. You know, monsters, you know, are, you know, some of them are long-lived, some of them have actual like really scary abilities. But
well,
if we're gonna,
it's kind of like, you know, we sometimes have to. It's insane that we still have to explain what the term Black Lives Matter really means, but there are times with people you have to really explain it to them, and and it's frustrating. But I think what, in the context of this book, yeah, monsters is a thing that we're grabbing onto, and we're saying like, yeah, you know, but at the same time we're saying we're not monsters, really. We're not, and you're not really gods, right? Because we say, the anarchists in this world say no gods, no masters, even though there's religious people everywhere, and there's people who master over us at our jobs, things that we have to live with in the society. Right. So yeah, I see where it comes from, and I thought the title was brilliant. Obviously, you can imagine me being me. I found this book because I was scrolling through the recently purchased books in the library app, and I saw the title and went, "Whoa, hey!" With nothing else, and I put it on hold. Right? Because,
that's great.
Yeah, because I saw the title and I was like, okay, I got to see what this is about. I knew nothing else. Now I'll tell you, when I went into this book, I read the title, put the book on hold at the library, and knew nothing. Went into it totally cold just because, I was excited when I saw like the Le Guin references and I was like, okay, I'm gonna get along with this author. I'm gonna get with this guy, right?
Right.
But anyways, that's besides the point. I'm talking too much in this interview. I'm just so excited.
No, I do want to comment on that because it's, to me, it's cool and exciting that you're like these things are obvious because my impulse is to under explain everything. I also don't like a lot of like explaining things, and so I tend to like most often not say anything or like hint at it or have it be implied in the subtext. And there's a few moments where either I had a beta reader read it, or my editor was like, maybe you should explain this a little bit more. And I was like, okay, fine. There's some places where I just kind of like, I was like, this is something I'll explain a little bit more. There's things it's all over the place. But there's also a few moments that I was just like, I'm gonna get dinged for this if I don't say it. So I'm gonna say it. This is the place to say it. So here it is. But I tend to really enjoy noticing a thing and being like, oh, that is a thing that, and I was paying attention. But some readers, one of the things that I know for a fact now, it's very apparent, is that some readers read this book and they're just like, what the heck? And that has been, quite an experience for me because I'm like, yeah.
I just want you to know I got a lot of it. Of it, and I think that I think once this book finds the right readers, and one of the things about it is that we talked about how like every anarchist recommends The Dispossessed, and the hope is that in 10 years everyone will be saying, anarchists will be saying, you got to read No Gods, No Monsters, right? Because it's a book.
I don't know about that. I feel like a baby in everything. Those influences I wear pretty much on my sleeve. But thank you for saying that.
Well, I'm just saying from my perspective, I'm going to put that out there. Like a bunch of my friends who are, people I know from the activist organizing community, whether they consider themselves anarchists or not, people who, for example, are fans of The Dispossessed, they're all people that I tagged in my review saying like, hey, check out this book, because I think, that's important. And what's cool is that The Dispossessed is getting a fresh round of people appreciating the first interview I did for Dickheads was with Carrie Vaughn. And she wrote a murder mystery called Bannerless, which is like The Dispossessed with a murder mystery. So I've called that book The Mayor of Easttown Meets The Dispossessed.
That is great.
Yeah. And
that's great.
Yeah, definitely should check that one out too. But it was funny when and I told her that, and she was like, "Oh my God, that's how I'm pitching it to Hollywood from now on." But I think that now we're getting like a whole generation of writers that were influenced by that book, who are paying it forward with their own versions of. It's not to say that Bannerless is exactly like The Dispossessed. It's a post-apocalyptic novel, so it has a totally different thing, but it takes place in an anarchist California after the fall of climate change future, and
wow.
and it presents these ideas that Le Guin was doing in another setting. And what you're doing is the same kind of thing. You have a lot of these like themes and ideas, and it's just cool to see this next generation. I think it's great, because I think a book like that, having all these tentacles out there in fiction is great. All right, so
thank you, appreciate that.
So we have in the end of the story, and I know I kind of brought this up already with the meeting, but the safe space thing seems to be like a huge theme of the what we're leaning towards at the end here is that we're setting up book 2, and you were obviously conscious when you were writing this that you were building towards, kind of a hook towards the future. How was writing that hook at the end, and how did you approach it? Okay, that was a big question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. That's just me, stewing. So, it's. I think I approached it the same way I approached most of the book. Is I was just like, what would intuitively work? What feels right? What amount of balances and kind of balances would work here? And when I approached the ending, I was like, I knew I wanted it to end where it began, with a certain POV. I knew I wanted to make certain connections for the reader, and if the reader, depending on where this reader is coming from, they will get excited about different things in the ending. There's some connections to I definitely consider The Lesson in No Gods, No Monsters sister books. And so there's some things there that people will, find satisfying. And then there's some, peeing off that POV and having that POV hit up against a thing like this cat that shows up earlier in the story, was also a thing that I wanted to finish out, or make that larger connection. And then there's this being that shows up in the in this person's room, Cal's room. I'll just say his name. Why not? And that connects back to the barn scene, and that connects back to some other things. And so there's all of these different beings and things that have made appearances in other parts of the book, or hinted at in other parts of the book, that are confirmed in this last scene. But the last scene is actually really quiet. It's just guy can't sleep, takes his niece on a drive. It's basically, that's how it ends. But there's all of these things that I'm just kind of like, subtly to my mind, pointing to or confirming. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I can tell you that I hadn't looked to see that this was a series before, because remember I told you all I knew was the title when I started reading. So when I was getting towards the end of the book, I was like, oh yeah, this is going on. This is continuing. I'm going to get more of this. And I was very excited about that. So
I'm glad.
Yeah. All right. So just to kind of wrap up the spoiler section, what do you think was your biggest narrative challenge in writing this book, and what do you think was the part that came together the easiest? And think of that in ways of how you can relate that to young writers that might be listening for advice.
Okay. So, when I wrote the book and I was thinking about the series name, it was No Gods, No Monsters, No Gods, No Monsters 1. So the whole series is called No Gods, No Monsters. The first book is called No Gods, No Monsters. But we talked about it, and we thought, I talked about it with a publisher, and they thought, and I agree, that it was confusing. So we went through a bunch of different names. I listed a bunch of names that I thought would do different things. The series name. I was like, if you pick this series name, it implies these things. If you pick this series name, it implies these things. My personal favorite is this one. And we kind of fell on the Convergence Saga as a good name because it prepares you for what happens in the book. And in my mind, it prepares you for what happens in the series. There's a lot of different players, and they're coming from completely different contexts, and they're joining, they're coming together. And that was hard to do, right. I had to make it all make sense. Like, why is Cal here? And why is this person here? And why does Abysia show up? And who is this cat god? And why is she here? And all of these things needed to make sense. And that was hard to do. And I came up with a structure of, Cal POV, new person's POV, new person, then Cal. Like it was 3 parts in threes. And so that helped me, the structuring. But I still had to make all of this come together in a way that would feel like every section led into the next section. And a lot of that isn't like timeline. A lot of that is like thematic things or
do you think that those of us who grew up on serialized television, right, or those of us who've been the last 10 years been watching so much serialized television have a better grasp of how to build these long narratives because we're watching, like I still to this day think, like, for example, Battlestar Galactica, the reboot, is like a masterclass in how to tell a story, right? And so for those of us who like really got into those shows, it's like now I think we can think longer terms of these things coming together. I don't know.
Right. No. I think you're right because, definitely there was 2 conceptual things that helped me when I was designing the book. I thought of it as, like an album, but an album that is thematically related, but each song is different. So it's like a track list and each song is different. But if you listen to the album in order, you get a thematic cohesiveness. I think that, albums aren't always that now, but, growing up, albums were these kinds of whole things that you listen to from beginning to end, and it told a whole story. There's a lot of hip hop influences as well in the book. So like playing around with that as well. And I also thought of it as a TV show, so I was like, here's episode 1 that introduces a certain thing. Here's episode 2 that introduces a certain thing. And if you're watching these episodes in order, it might be disorienting for a bit, but they all just come back to this central idea. It's like in some ways, an anthology series meets something like, a good example of this is The Leftovers, which I'm a huge fan of, but each episode is focused on a character, but it pushes along this overarching narrative.
Okay, so what's the part that came together the easiest?
I think the horror, it was something that was surprisingly easy for me to get to, even though I, until I would say relatively recently did not write horror, but it wasn't, and when I was writing it, I didn't think of it as horror, which I think helped. Some people are creeped out by certain moments in the book, but in my mind, I wasn't trying to write horror, and I felt I would be intimidated if I thought of it that way. I just wanted things to be unnerving, so that came together.
In my review, I pointed out 2 parts that I thought were really great moments of horror. That one was with the earth shaking and one of the monsters, and the other one was the skin shudder part that I thought were really, 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 really great moments of horror. So, on
Thank
my
you.
own, I agreed with you already. So.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So, is there any lessons that you wish that you had known before you started that this process, like,
Always.
Yeah, that's true. That's kind of
No. I do want to. I'll answer it because it's one of those things where I think there was a thing that I understood to some degree when I was a reader of other people's work that now I understand much better now as a writer, is that nothing's done, and that so much of what comes together in a book is based on outside context. Like a book isn't a book by itself, even though I think that people tend to treat books as if they exist in a vacuum. It was a really weird year to write this book, and a lot of that came into the book. A lot of that influenced the book, and even now when I reread the book, I'm like, there's things that I think are better because it happened during this time, and then there's things that I would have done differently, if I was in a different, more stable time. And books are like that. And it's I feel like I'm learning that with this new book, that the second book in the trilogy, I'm just like, I had an idea of what I thought was going to work, and it's not. And then I let go of it, and now things are working. And it's one of those things that is always surprising. It's what you think a story needs and what ends up being the story is different.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great feeling when you get the, people say a lot of times like that writers are motivated by seeing the book in print. And I think they're more motivated by those moments when everything comes together creatively.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true.
That's way better feeling, is like when you solve the problem narratively and you're moving forward. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Longer lasting, I think.
Yeah, I have the novel I wrote during lockdown was one I'd been planning for 5 years, and it became so much more about partisanship than I ever planned, because of the times when we were writing it. And what's funny too is I had an experience, I love telling this story, that I had written a scene where a character went into a store where there was no food on the shelves because everyone was rioting and freaking out. And I had outlined that scene 5 years earlier. And 2 days before I wrote that scene, we were in lockdown, and I went to grocery store at some point to try and just get some food or whatever, and the pasta aisle was completely empty except for one box or one row of kale-based pasta was on the shelf. And I had written the outline for the scene 5 years earlier, and just he went to the shelves and they were completely barren. And because 5 years later I was in lockdown, now the novel has the kale pasta on the shelf by itself because I lived it. Yeah.
The world is so strange. Oh man, wow.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not anti-kale pasta. I just, I'm just saying that was an experience that I had. And writing during 2020 was a thing,
Right. The kale pasta makes sense because a lot of people wouldn't go for it. But it's one of those details that makes a scene come alive. Again, also nothing against, like, no knock on kale pasta, but it is the thing that if something remained, it would remain, and that like gives a life to a scene that.
Yeah.
And that was gifted to you by reality. It's weird how many conversations I had with spec people about, the pandemic subgenre. Like the either the pandemic that's happening and the world is kind of reeling from it, or the post-apocalyptic like pandemic story, and how looking at how reality matches the genre and doesn't match the genre was really interesting. It was just this surreal moment where spec and reality was the same. I mean, is the same. And it's just wild. It definitely this time influenced the novel in ways that I could not have anticipated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's I don't know. I think this one comments very well on the times too. That's one of the things I appreciated. All right, Cadwell, I took up a great amount of your morning, and I really appreciate the time. I think my listeners will really enjoy hearing about this book, and it gives them another reason to go out and buy it, which of course I appreciate. I'm looking forward to book 2. When's the? Are you working on it currently, or? Yeah.
I am. I've gotten people. No pressure, right? I've gotten people like, okay, I'm ready. Where is it? I've gotten a few people like that, and I'm very excited that people have had that response. That makes me very happy. It's due soon. So like, I'm working on it. It's kicking my butt, but it's due soon. It's not too far off. But books, book time is, there's gonna be, some space between this one and the next one. But hopefully it'll be, a good wait, and the second book will do well.
talking about book 2 or Dune Part 2, like having to wait for it. It's like you understand that the majority of the life of that movie you will have both. You just have to be patient. Wait, you know. So people are just used to getting everything really quick.
Yeah, I've just got the last book of the Expanse, and it's just like you just, the book world is different. Even, and the Expanse was like, you know, James is it James S. Corey? They've been pretty on time with their deadlines. You know, the books have come out pretty steadily over the years, but you still have to wait like a year or a year and a half. This one was a little bit longer of a wait. And, you know, that's books, you know, like that's just how it works. And so I think if you are a person that reads books and reads series, you know, through novels, I think it prepares you for film. You're kind of like, oh, okay, I can win a year, whatever. You know, like that's, a year sounds like a short period of time. It's like the Avengers 1 and 2, Infinity War, and you know, now I'm forgetting all titles. This is weird. Endgame. And I was like, this was like a blink and it was there. You know, like people were so frustrated. I was just like, I can wait. I think this is fine.
Absolutely. All right. No Gods, No Monsters is available wherever buy books, I'm sure. People can find it. The lesson I'm looking forward to reading is out there. And hopefully I'll have you back for book 2. That is the plan. I very excited.
Hit me up.
Yeah. Very excited to read it. Is there anything else you want to leave my listeners with?
Oh no, I'm just grateful that, you know, you invited me on, and thank you so much. And yeah, if any of you are short fiction readers, I do write short fiction as well. If you want to like try out something shorter before you invest in a book, I have a ton of short fiction out there that you could check out.
Awesome. Yeah, Cadwell, thanks for joining us, and report back to us on what you think of Clive Barker, because I think you'll really enjoy it, especially Cabal. Yeah.
Okay, that's the first one I'm going to. So
yeah,
thank you. Thank you for that rec.
Yeah, that is like a sister book for similar themes. Very, very, very cool. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining me, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Hopefully soon.